Hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News TV. And in today's news brief, we're going to take a look at an H5N1 avian influenza update. And this has been hot topic in the news for the past week or so. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the latest. So in a follow-up to the avian influenza situation in the U.S., the H5N1 situation, the CDC issued a Health Alert Network health advisory on Friday to inform clinicians, state health departments, and the public of a recently confirmed human infection with highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 in the U.S. following exposure, presumably to an infected dairy cattle. Now, it's a farm worker on a commercial dairy farm in Texas developed conjunctivitis on approximately March 27th of this year and subsequently tested positive for HPAI influenza A H5N1 virus infection. These viruses have been reported in the area's dairy cattle and in wild birds. There have been no previous reports of the spread of HPAI viruses from cows to humans. Now, respiratory and conjunctival samples were collected on March 28th and tested at Texas Tech University's Bioterrorism Response Laboratory that same day. The real-time PCR analysis indicated that both specimens were presumptive positive for influenza A H5 virus. The specimens were sent to the CDC for further testing. They were received and tested at CDC on March 30th and confirmed as H5N1 virus clade 2.3.4.4b using diagnostic real-time PCR and sequencing. Now, the patient reported conjunctivitis and no other symptoms. He was not hospitalized and is recovering. The patient was recommended to isolate and received antiviral treatment with Tamiflu. Illness has not been identified in the patient's household members who received Tamiflu for post-exposure prophylaxis. No additional cases of human infection with H5N1 virus associated with the current infections in dairy cattle and birds in the United States, and no human-to-human transmission of H5N1 virus have been identified. Well, currently in the U.S., H5N1 virus detections among wild birds are widespread. There are sporadic outbreaks among poultry and backyard flocks, and sporadic infections in wild animals that have been reported by the USDA. On March 25th, the USDA reported the first detections of H5N1 in dairy cattle in Texas and in Kansas. Since then, additional detections in dairy cattle have been reported from Idaho, Michigan, New Mexico, and Ohio. The USDA is continuing to monitor and test samples collected from other farms where cattle are displaying similar symptoms. So we have 6 states so far where dairy cattle have tested positive. A little bit more information on the virus. In a very good CIDRAP report this week, they write that virologists are looking for clues as genetic sequences and U.S. ruminants and wild birds are uploaded into public databases. Louise Moncla, PhD, assistant professor of pathology at the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, said yesterday on X that USDA scientists have rapidly sequenced full genomes that she and her collaborators have added them to the Next Strain Visual tool, which allows scientists to map the family tree of virus sequences. She said sequences from the dairy cows nest with those from wild bird samples collected from Texas about the same time. However, goat samples from Minnesota are more similar to pheasant sequence from Colorado. Moncla said none of the PB2 sequences have known adaptive markers, and the similarity of internal genes from wild bird and cattle sequences suggests direct transmission from wild birds. The cases are unusual because influenza A have never been reported in ruminants before, she said. Following up on these cows and keeping an eye on other species will be important going forward. So we'll go back to what the CDC, they provided a whole bunch of recommendations in their Health Alert Network. And the first group of recommendations were for clinicians. And they say clinicians should consider the possibility of HPAI H5N1 virus infection in people showing signs or symptoms of acute respiratory illness or conjunctivitis and who have relevant exposure history outlined in their different guidelines. Examples of symptoms include, but are not limited to, mild illness like cough, sore throat, eye redness, or eye discharge, such as conjunctivitis, fever or feeling feverish, rhinorrhea, fatigue, myalgia, arthralgia, and headache. Now, moderate to severe illness types of symptoms you may see are shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, altered mental state, and seizures. And complications could include pneumonia, respiratory failure, acute respiratory distress syndrome, multi-organ failure, sepsis, and meningoencephalitis. If signs and symptoms compatible with H5N1 virus infection are present, CDC recommends isolate the patient and follow infection control recommendations, including using personal protective equipment or PPE. Initiate empiric antiviral treatment as soon as possible. Do not delay treatment while waiting for laboratory results. Notify the state and local health department to arrange testing for H5N1 virus. Collect respiratory samples from the patient to test for influenza A H5N1 virus at the state health department. If the exposed person has conjunctivitis with or without respiratory symptoms, both a conjunctival swab and a nasopharyngeal swab should be collected for testing. Encourage patients to isolate at home away from their household members, not to go to work or go to school until it is determined they do not have the infection. And starting empiric antiviral treatment with oral or enterical administered Tamiflu twice daily for 5 days is recommended regardless of time since onset of symptoms. Antiviral treatment should not be delayed while waiting for laboratory results. And then another portion of the same CIDRAP article, they asked the question, who's most at risk on dairy farms, right? We have all these issues with cattle with this infection. And they say federal health officials have said that the avian flu outbreaks on dairy herds and the new infection in Texas doesn't change the threat assessment, which is low for the public. They have also emphasized the safety of the nation's milk supply due to safety nets, including pasteurization, while warning against drinking raw milk that can harbor these pathogens. Now, in the latest Moo's Room podcast, Dr. Joe Armstrong, a cattle production expert with the University of Minnesota, urged dairy farm operators at farms where the virus is confirmed or suspected to focus on those at greatest risk, especially if PPE is limited. He said the most at-risk groups are anyone who works with raw milk, including those in milking parlors, employees who work with calves, and people who work with bulk tanks. He also said those with immunocompromised conditions such as pregnancy are at greater risk. And I found this next part to be pretty key. Armstrong also urged dairy operators to ensure that workers, including those from other countries who don't speak English as their first language, know the illness symptoms to report. Quote, they may or may not be willing to seek medical help when they need it. If you are out there and you have employees who fit this description, You need to be advocating for them and watching out for them, Armstrong said. Check in with them, make sure everything's okay, make sure they understand what's happening. Wise advice. And lastly, the CDC had some recommendations for the public. And they say people should avoid being near sick or dead animals or surfaces contaminated with the animal's feces, litter, raw milk, or other byproducts when not wearing respiratory or eye protection. Animals in which HPAI-A H5N1 virus infection have been identified include wild birds, poultry, other domesticated birds, and other wild or domesticated animals, including livestock, such as cattle and goats. And as always, people should not prepare or eat uncooked or undercooked food or related uncooked food products such as unpasteurized or raw milk, raw cheeses from animals with suspected or confirmed H5N1 virus infection. So that's some of the latest stuff that's coming out about this very newsworthy situation with H5N1 avian influenza in the United States. So if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment below, share with your friends, and I'll see you next time on Outbreak News TV.